record this, and we are recording.
Okay, very good. Today we're continuing with our three-part series on Michelangelo Buonarroti called Il Divino, or the Divine. And we began to find out last week why he was called divine. And part of it is, when we looked at his apprenticeship, is that he never finished his apprenticeship. He was only apprenticed for a couple years before he moved in to the Palazzo Medici at the behest of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who treated him like one of his sons. And he was like the golden boy. He was like the resident genius, I guess, is how you describe him. And because of that early connection with the Medici prince, he was able to continue to have very lucrative relationships with not only Lorenzo, but with other members of the Medici family, as we'll see today. When we took his career up last time, so the time when he's 29, when he got that commission to do the wonderful David, which was originally meant to be in the bell tower of the cathedral, the Duomo, but everyone loved it so much that they decided to put it right there in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, where a perfect copy of it, an indistinguishable copy of it remains to this day, and you can see it right there. And remember now, Savonarola's dictatorship is over, the Republic is reestablished, and Michelangelo's David was more than a religious statue, a symbol of Florentine independence, of the little guy being able to take on Goliath. And in some ways, he faces south. That implied Goliath could be the Pope. But actually, and here is the copy is so excellent that it's really amazing. And I wanted to show you an interesting thing that I saw. And of course, his incredible intense gaze. That moment before he springs into action, where he's scoping out Goliath. But I wanted to show you an art installation that they did in Florence to mark the COVID, and they fashioned this huge mask, surgical mask, and put it on the David that's in the square. The real David, the one that's made by Michelangelo's own hands, is in the Accademia. But this is the original place, or this is the original place it was put. And I think it still has a lot of significance for seeing it there. At the same time, his career was just absolutely taking off in his late 20s and around 30. He was given another commission, what possibly would have led to other ones, for a colossal apostle, the apostle Matthew, one of Jesus's disciples. And he never finished it because he got called to Rome. But I think some of these unfinished pieces are very interesting in themselves because partly because they teach us something about Michelangelo's unusual technique. Because remember, he never really studied sculpture. He somehow picked up sculpture on his own. He might have gotten some tips here and there from the artists that were around the circle of the Medici family, but he never finished his apprenticeship. And his apprenticeship was to a painter, not to a sculptor. And his work does not look at all like, well, for someone self-trained, it's pretty good. It is just absolutely incredible. And here is the unfinished thing. And I think it's interesting here because you can see his extensive use of the drill. He uses a drill, and you can see these sort of drill marks here. He drills into the marble, and then once the marble has become destabilized by selective drilling, then he goes in with the chisel. And you can see sometimes the marks of the chisel here that has three, I don't know what you call them, that has three parts to it, so that it makes a groove that has three things. But another interesting thing isn't only his extensive use of the drill, and I don't know how many artists use the drill in this way, but also much more unusual is how he just sort of attacks the marble from one position, from one side, and he just kind of chips it away until it's there. Now, if you go and you take a class on sculpture and you're looking at the human figure, whether it's clay or marble or what, but let's say it's clay, for example, right? Like we teach at my university, you'd be modeling something from a model, for example, but you're continuously walking around it. You're continuously evaluating it from different viewpoints so that you don't, for example, come to the end and there's not enough stone to do the back because, but he doesn't do that. He develops it just from one side. And it does remind me very much of when we discussed that last time, when they asked him about the ruined marble, what he might be able to do. And he said, remember, David is in there and I have only to release him from the stone. And of course, David is a very finished piece. This is a very unfinished piece, but you can see it almost has that quality, almost as if the figure is struggling to come out of the stone. And Matthew has his gospel book in his hands because he wrote one of the four gospels. And he was also involved in his first really large painting project, and that was to do one of the walls in the Palazzo Vecchio, because remember, Florence was a commune, so it was ruled by council, not by prince. And I think this was the chamber that the dueling artists, Michelangelo and Leonardo, were each asked to do one wall. And this is the drawing we have after the cartoon by an assistant. And it's not up to the level of a Michelangelo drawing, but it's quite large. And it gives us a really detailed idea of what exactly he intended to do. But like the Leonardo piece, it was never finished because he was called away to Rome by Pope Julius II. And Pope Julius II was an interesting pope because he was very ambitious and he wanted to do a couple things. First of all, his predecessor, Alexander VI, Rogerio Borgia, was one of the most notoriously corrupt, evil, had illegitimate children, like Cesare Borgia, that he sought to take over different parts of Italy. He had torture chambers. He had a daughter, Lucretia, who had a poison in her ring, and the old stories go on and on. And so Pope Julius he thought, I want to rehabilitate the office of the Pope. This office has been disgraced by my predecessor. And I'm going to show people that this can be a respectable thing to be a Pope. He was a Franciscan. That is, he would follow St. Francis. But he was also very ambitious. He not only wanted to reestablish the seat of the Pope as a respected ethical, moral leadership in the world, but he also had very personal ambitions as well. And one of them was to rebuild Rome and to make Rome from the sort of interesting ruins, medieval town into the gigantic urban center that it became during the Renaissance and the subsequent centuries. To revive Rome, to bring it back, he was trying to bring it back to the level that it had been at its height of the Roman Empire before Christianity, even at the height of the empire. He wanted to have Rome have that sort of moral authority and be that sort of a central hub for Christianity. This is a little coin that was struck that shows a portrait of Pope Julius II. On the other side of the coin is the design that Donato Bramante made for the new St. Peter's, because St. Peter's, which was over 1,000 years old, was falling apart. And although it was a huge basilica built in the 4th century, it now had a lot of structural problems. And he decided, let's just bulldoze it. They didn't have bulldozers, but let's just tear it down and let's build an even larger, more magnificent church that will really symbolize Rome as the center of Christendom. And remember, there weren't any Protestants. That wasn't until later. And this is Bramante's design, his original design for St. Peter's. Bramante eventually died, and Michelangelo took over the commission and changed it quite a bit. But this coin is often used to show us what it was intentionally, what was the original intention of it when it was commissioned in 1506, the year after Michelangelo had been called to Rome. And what Pope Julius wanted him to do isn't to do any architecture, but wanted him to design the sculptures and the kind of architectural setting for a magnificent tomb that would be one of the grandest in all Christendom. And he wanted to place it in St. Peter's so that it would, be right there next to St. Peter's tomb, right? Which is the high altar is built over what is said to be the tomb of St. Peter. And so this is a modern reconstruction based on descriptions and letters, the best we can guess at what was the original intention between Pope Julius and Michelangelo, who worked together on it. And it was a very grandiose scheme, and it was never completely carried out. And a very reduced sort of version of it is now in St. Peter's in Chains. It's not in St. Peter's at all. It's in another church, St. Peter in Chains, in Trastevere, a neighborhood, I believe. Now, this one had, a walk-in door, and it had a sarcophagus, we think, of the Pope, maybe with an image of him lying on top of it, for the prophet, Isaiah and Moses, and then the contemplative life and the active life were two ideas he had. And then on the first story, and he designed all the architectural things too here. It was going to be kind of like a little building, a mausoleum that would be within the church of St. Peter's. And it was, and then down here, we're supposed to be victories, right? And on each side of them, bound captives struggling to get out of their chains. And so that this was the original design as best as we can make it out. It haunted him for the next 40 years because it was such an immense undertaking. And the way he originally designed it was just going to enslave him for the rest of his life, or for many, many years, and would be a great burden to him. And we'll look at that. But I want to look at a couple of the statues that came out of the first period before the Sistine Chapel. And some of the bound captives are fully realized, as these two from the Louvre are. And this one's sometimes called the Rebellious Slave, because he seems to be struggling against his bondage to try to be free. And you can see his face shows that sort of determination. His body is incredibly lean and muscular and idealized, but you can see the cloth things that bind him, and he struggles to be free of them. And this is often said to represent the struggle of the soul inside the body, the struggle between the body and the soul. Because remember, the Christians, like the ancient Greeks, believed that there was a soul and it inhabited the body, and then it left the body at death. And so they saw this struggle between the soul and the body. This is very different than the Jewish approach, which is that the soul and the body are really one thing, and you can't have one without the other. So here there's this kind of struggle going on between the sort of pure and good soul made in the image of God and the flesh with all its physical desires, and the struggle between this higher divine being and the kind of lower, more animalistic being. So he kind of embodies this struggle in these figures. This one is really beautiful as well. And this captive seems to be more resigned to his bondage. He sort of is relaxed and doesn't struggle at all. The face is incredibly serene, and it has been called for centuries the dying slave. Although, as if I understand it correctly, it wasn't Michelangelo's original name, but it was a name that was applied later on to it. And it includes double entendre in Italian. Morire, which means to die, also is a euphemism for to come to sexual climax. And so the dying slave has of these implications because of that slang of sexuality, of kind of a post-orgasmic thing. And so that's one of the interesting kind of sexual dimensions to the whole thing, because he doesn't avoid he sees the struggle of the whole man with the soul, wrestling the angel and the baboon, or whatever, wrestling for to be released from earth with all its temptations and so forth. Michelangelo, by the way, was also a poet. And in his sonnets, you find this melancholy feeling of sometimes elation, but often of struggle with sin and of guilt, and intimations of actual death, not only sexual sort of intimations. I think some of the most interesting sculptures that Michelangelo did are the unfinished slaves, or the unfinished captives, because like with this one, it seems almost like he's struggling to release himself from the marble block as much as he's struggling to release himself from the bondage of the flesh. And I think it's really interesting. Again, you can see how instead of moving around the sculpture, doing it from all sides, he just attacks it from one side, and it sort of, and he brings it to a pretty high level of finish, while the back is not blocked out even at all. It's a very, very unusual way of doing it. And, another one of the interesting and strange things about this divine Michelangelo. He seems to defy tradition as much as he fulfills it in many ways. Here's another one, it's struggling, it seems, almost to emerge from the block. Now, I know he didn't originally conceive of them that way, but it is a way that we look at them. And I think especially after the great 19th century sculptor Rodin, Auguste Rodin, who did The Thinker, as you're probably aware of. And Rodin did a lot of unfinished sculptures that gave us a new aesthetic of sort of this unfinished sculpture thing. And so we see them kind of almost through the eyes of the late 19th century Rodin. He finished some of the victories, but this is one that he finished actually after the Sistine Chapel. And this one has a pretty high level of finish. It's a little larger than life size, about 8.5 feet tall, and it's called Victory. And as you can see, this young, very muscular man is victorious over a much older man who has a beard, who is tied up and on his knees. And Victory uses him almost as a cushion, or and kneels with one knee to show that dominance, to show that sort of victory. And victory in this case seems a victory over something. And I think, again, it's the metaphor of the victory of the spiritual over the crassly physical. But another thing I want to point out in this particular sculpture is how it has this corkscrew kind of serpentine, they call it, kind of a line, which anticipates later Mannerist and even Baroque sculpture. So already at the height of the Renaissance, he's seeing ahead a century or two to later work. And there's actually quite a bit of distortion if you look at this. This is interesting. This didn't end up in Rome at all. This ended up in Florence, and it's there in the Palazzo Vecchio. So you see the David outside, and you come inside, and you can see his victory. But then he stopped work on it for a while. The Pope rode his army into Bologna and took over Bologna. and they had to put the tomb on hold for a while. And the Pope thought, I want you to paint apostles for the ceiling of the Pope's private chapel, which is pretty big. It's not a small chapel, it's a pretty big chapel. And here you can see an engraving of the Sistina before Michelangelo's paintings. And you can see there are already paintings on the side that were from the life of Moses and by the life of Christ, and as kind of parallels from the Old Testament and the New Testament, and by Botticelli and by Perugino and Ghirlandaio, the artist to whom Michelangelo had been apprenticed for those couple of years when he was 15, 14. So here, the ceiling was at that time just painted blue with little gold stars in gold leaf attached to the top. And what they wanted to, there were these 12 of these triangular shaped supports to the ceiling. And he thought it would be good to have the 12 apostles, one of them on each of these, triangular shaped things. And so he actually began that, but then reconsidered it, and perhaps in council with the cousin of the Pope, who was a theologian, I forget his name, but he was very learned in the Bible and also in the ancient Greek philosophy, and tried to bring together Greek pagan philosophy with Christian theology. We've seen that happen before. And so he's maybe partly the brains behind it. We'll probably never know who came up with the idea of showing the creation of the world. So they abandoned the 12 apostles. They actually chipped it off. It was in plaster because it was fresco, and he began anew. And this kind of spine of the series is the creation of the world, but going backwards and starting with Noah and the flood, and then going to the creation of man, and then to the creation of the world. So as you come into the Sistine Chapel, and here we are facing the high altar and looking at his much later, Last Judgment, which he didn't do at this time. On the far wall, under where the altar is, we can see it starts here with the deluge, and proceeds. Let's see, where is it here? First of all, the drunkenness of Noah. Noah, after the whole thing and surviving the whole thing, just gets drunk and passes out, and his sons see him, and this is a shameful thing. And this has something to do with the shame of Adam. I'm not sure how theologically it works out, but that's the very first scene. As you see, after God rescues everybody from everything, Noah goes and kind of screws it up again. And it shows how it's a non-ending cycle. In Catholicism, unlike some types of Protestantism, where you're saved and then you're always saved after that, in Catholicism, you're like saved and then you lose it, and then you're saved again and then you lose it. So it's always this constant kind of struggle. And I think the Sistine shows that kind of a life of spiritual struggle, of always kind of going back to the beginning. And that's why I think it begins with the last story and kind of goes backward in time as you move toward the center. Also, on the sides, instead of the 12 apostles, he put alternatingly prophets from the Hebrew Bible, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, and alternated those with Sibyls, who were prophetesses from the ancient Greek world, like the Oracle of Delphi. And these very enigmatic sort of writings in the ancient world were said by Neoplatonic philosophers to also predict Christ, just like the Old Testament had predicted Jesus. So, and again, this shows this attempted harmony between, pre-Christian thought and Christian thought in a new synthesis. Well, here's the very dramatic, and he painted them in this order. Oh, I wanted to dispel one myth. That is, Michelangelo did not paint the Sistine Chapel on his back. He made a very special scaffolding that was anchored, it was wood, and it was anchored in the windows, the small windows, So he built a permanent platform that he could stand up, and his head was up, and he painted like that. And he said paint came in his face and all that. And it got for a while that he had done so much of this that even to read, he had to do it like that because he became so accustomed to that, working like that very closely. Remember, he didn't have any assistants really because he was never made a maestro. So he wasn't even authorized to make the painting. Much less have assistants carry out parts of it. So he went slowly. It took him 4 years to do the whole thing, but the whole thing pretty much is by his own hand. Okay, so let's look at the Deluge. It's a very dramatic piece. People are trying to desperately to escape from the ever rising water. Some of it's very, very moving, the sort of human drama that's involved. The central figure with the wind sort of blows her veil around her. She cradles this child in her arms, but we know that they're all doomed. Everybody except the Noah and his family and the animals that are in the ark are doomed. And so we kind of know the sad ending to the story before it. And everyone is shown nude, not because they were nude in real life, but because he shows them idealized in this way. There is another high point slightly behind the outcropping in the very front, a last sort of bit of rock of the ever rising water. And it looks like some people have taken refuge here, have made sort of a makeshift tent. And here, I think most poignantly, this old man carries the corpse of his dead young son, who he's rescued, who must have drowned, is rescuing his body and taking it to this high ground for the last, the last few hours of their existence. Because as you know, everybody dies in this deluge. And Noah's Ark, shown in the background, is going away. And people are even trying to climb aboard, and they're being shoved away because he can't take everybody on board. And so it's a tragic beginning to the story. And then we move back in time, sort of, to a scene that shows both the temptation and fall of Adam, how Adam eats the fruit from the forbidden tree, and then how they are expelled by the angel's sword from paradise. If we look at this side, we can see some interesting things. First of all, the mastery of anatomy is incredible in it, but it's interesting, and it has the female figure especially has a masculine quality, and this characterizes his treatment of the female figure. He doesn't do the female figure very often, and when he does, they really resemble male figures with these incredible builds. And she's taking the apple from the serpent. Now, the serpent is also gendered. In the Bible, the serpent doesn't say male or female, but here it's a female. And clearly, not only the long hair, but the breast. And the serpent, she kind of hands Eve, who sort of turns around. She's turning towards sin, turning toward that sort of thing. Adam reaches over to grab one, and in a moment it will all be done. Notice also there's a sort of sexual impropriety of the closeness of his genitals to her head. And I think we're not as sensitive to this now because, TV commercials, everything from, bread to whiskey or whatever is kind of sold with all sorts of sexual innuendos. And we become a little jaded, actually, to the really kind of shocking sexuality implied here. But also it's very biblical because remember, they knew no shame. They didn't know they were naked. They were just very, very natural. But here, of course, they now disobey God, and then they're cast out of paradise. And in this one, very much looks like that Masaccio expulsion from paradise that he copied when he was a teenager, when he was in Florence. And here the angel turns the sword, and Adam and Eve walk away, kind of cower away shamefully. Going back even further, we look at the creation of Eve herself. And here Adam falls into a deep slumber, and God, who actually stands on the earth in this one, so his feet are mostly, he's floating, but here he's on the earth, and he kind of calls her forth, beckoning her into existence. And it's just really, it's really beautiful. And I love also the figure of Adam, how passive he is, how pliant, how undisturbed by this. And God creates woman because man is lonely. He brings all the animals to man and names them all, but there's nothing that really will be a friend and a helper and an equal. And so he kind of brings forth Eve. And the central panel, the central scene in this spine across the ceiling is the creation of Adam, which is of course the most celebrated piece, and it's the central thing to the whole conception of it, because the creation of humankind, the creation of man, is really the beginning of the story. And now we're going back before sin, before death, before shame, and we're finding Adam as a newborn. Adam in Hebrew means earth, means ground, means soil. So Adam was made from the soil. He was made of mud. And then God, it says in Genesis, breathed in him the breath of life, and he became a living being. However, Michelangelo takes some liberties with the story. And instead of breathing into Adam, he sort of, almost like through an electrical current, almost touches his finger. And like an electric charge leaping, a synapse in the brain almost, Adam comes to life. And notice how incredibly built Adam is. He doesn't have the slender kind of swimmer's build of David, but now has a much heavier, exaggeratedly masculine frame with a barrel chest and gigantic shoulders and hands. And he's moving from the idealism of 5th century Greece, like in Polycletus's spear bearer, the Doryphorus, to this, the Farnese Hercules, which was unearthed in Rome. It was part of an archaeological dig that happened during the Renaissance. Part of what, as the Pope was trying to dig around and build new structures, they found there was a lot of ruins of Rome that they didn't know existed. And one of them was these magnificent baths of Caracalla. And they were, and this is a colossal statue. It's, I don't know, 15 feet, 12, 15 feet tall. It's a copy of a lost Greek bronze original, but you can see that the build is much heavier. It's not the slender sort of idealism of the Greeks, but a sort of overblown, hyper masculine god of Hercules. And this is his new ideal of masculinity. So he's moving away from realism. It was always idealized, but he's moving toward this kind of colossal, this sort of, a Herculean, I guess that's a word, concept of man. But at the same time that this body is so powerfully built, look at how incredibly passive he is. He's just like Jello. He's just waiting to be formed. His body takes the shape of a concave, kind of receptive surface. So he's this very, very beautiful, idealized Adam, but he's very, very passive and very, very adoring of Jesus. Look at the face of Jesus, of God, right? Because his face sort of turns away and looks kind of longingly at the parent, Because remember, Adam is not a full-grown man. He's a newborn, fully grown man. And so he's like a little passive kitten in some ways. As magnificent and godlike as he is, he completely kind of submits to the will of the creator. And so it's a wonderful kind of metaphor. In the meantime, he shows God. And in the Middle Ages, you weren't supposed to show God. You know, it was just a hand or something like that. But here he looks again at another sculpture that also was unearthed during the Renaissance, and that's the Leia Quan. And this was a Hellenistic sculpture, I guess a Roman copy of a Hellenistic sculpture, and an ancient Roman copy. And it represents Leia Quan, who was a priest of Troy. And he said to them, don't take the horse into Troy. And of course they did. And the gods were so mad at this priest that they killed him by showering snakes. And snakes bit him and devoured him and his sons. And these are his sons and him, you know, struggling with the snakes. And they lose. But look at that, again, the physique. The older, you know, the old priest has the physique of a bodybuilder. And the same thing here. God, although he's old, he's maybe in his 60s, I guess, is how you judge his age. He's incredibly vital. His body is beautifully formed, and that same heroic Herculean kind of dimensions that he has in Adam, because Adam is made in the image of God. So there is this, Adam is the son, right? And he's the father, and they have this kind of relationship. Also, I wanted to point out that as he's making Adam, he's already thinking of Eve. And here Eve sort of peeks out. Do you see her there? Right here. If I can get my arrow to move there. There she is, right here. She's sort of just emerging from behind God and looking at her new husband as he's being brought to life. So Eve, even before her creation, she's already there in the mind of God as a concept. This, of course, is the famous fingers that don't entirely touch. And this does bring to mind a new, another concept that was, no, I'll get to that in a minute. I forgot my sequence here. I wanted to point out the cleaning that went on. When I first saw the Sistine Chapel back in the Mesozoic period when I was a young man, it was before the cleaning, and this is the way it looked. And we were told Michelangelo was a sculptor. He didn't like to paint, didn't really understand color, and so he made everything kind of brown and gray like stone. And that was because he didn't like painting and didn't understand color. And so when we cleaned it, you know, and look at this is from the middle of the cleaning. It was this Japanese company. And they found it was not only smoke and dirt and stuff like that they knew was going to be there from the incense and the candles, but there was also glue, and there was also other glue and pigments of different kinds. And the restoration was halted at one point because some scholars felt that we're stripping away the outer layers and getting to what is essentially the underpainting. But that controversy is kind of past. And I don't know of anyone who believes that anymore. And as someone who's seen it before and after, I must say, it looks different. It is very readable. He really uses very strong colors. So who would have thought that God is going to be wearing this kind of like sheer pink tunic, right? Or that Adam would have green shadows in his neck and purple shadows in his chest and so forth. Who would have thought? This is another interesting thing that a psychiatrist, that is a medical doctor, in the Journal of the American Medical Association in the late 80s, noticed that God resembles a brain that's been cut in half. And remember, Michelangelo, like Leonardo before him, dissected corpses in the morgue, corpses that hadn't been claimed, like homeless people and things like that, that would have been thrown into a pauper's grave. But he, to understand the musculature and so forth, and so would have been perhaps familiar with the look of a brain. And although it's a speculative kind of thesis, I find it just fascinating how every kind of detail of the brain seems to be there. And the implication is God is the brains of the universe. Then if we go back even more in time, as we move toward the altar, we see God creating, before man, God creating the sun and moon very authoritatively. Sun over there, moon over there. And look at his face. Talk about that terribile, right? That moment of almost anger that possesses him, that he's about to move into action as he kind of flies through the air. It's an amazing, commanding image of God, unequaled. Now, the very last or very first scene, the first scene in creation, but the very last scene in this sequence as we move toward the altar, right above the high altar, is God moving over the face of the waters and separating the light from the darkness. So this is the very first day of creation. You know, God creates light and darkness. The light he calls day, and the darkness he called night, evening and morning, the first day. So here he is, and this is the only one that shows it from our perspective. We look up and he floats over us. So we're looking up at the clouds and God is kind of floating over the waters, separating on the one side darkness and the other side light. And the implication is, besides lightness and dark, that it also implicates good and evil and those moral choices that Adam and Eve had failed at, frankly. So that we have a chance to redo it, and we'll probably screw it up too. But you kind of keep coming back, so that the idea of coming into the church and moving toward the altar, it's like you're moving back in time. You're shedding years of punishment and guilt and shame and so forth, and getting back to the primordial, irreducible essence. And there is where, right below, this miracle that the Catholics say is happening in the Mass, where the bread and the wine is being transformed into the body and blood of Christ. So this is the kind of the most mystical part of the whole thing. And it's in a way, a very strangely quiet culmination to the whole thing. So you go back to your roots, back to the before mankind, before everything, to the primordial separation of good and evil, of light and darkness, and you kind of begin again. And then you can walk back out of the Sistina, right? And inevitably you will fall again and need to come to be reminded of kind of where you come from. So it's the theological implications are interesting as well. I want to show you just a little more of the cleaning. Here is the prophet Isaiah from the Hebrew Bible, and he has his prophecies right there in the book. He's kind of turned to the side as if he had been leaning on his hand, and the cherub has said something to him. Remember that the Doni Tondo, very young piece by him when he's in his early 20s, his only oil painting, had very strong clashing colors. We looked at it last week. We shouldn't have believed the myth that he didn't understand color, because look at what it looks like after the cleaning. I mean, the difference between the before and after are truly amazing. If we get in really close, we can see that linear quality continues, but look at how he indicates the hair, just a few strokes that read from down there very, very strongly. But look at the colors he uses. For example, here he uses a yellow sleeve, but the shadows are purple, right? Not brown and gray, shadows that are the opposite color of the garment. And this, the Impressionists, hundreds of years later, will know that shadows often contain the perception of the opposite color of the object being represented. We have similar thing going on in here between the green and the red. The shadow, you might not be able to see it right away, but there's some red added to that green that makes it this kind of colored dark green, but it serves to mute it to a certain extent. It's just absolutely amazing painting. So I thought I'd bring in, Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter from the cover of the Saturday Evening Post from the 1940s, during with the time when women entered the workplace. And he does this witty takeoff on Isaiah. I don't know how many people at the time caught the art historical references. She does have that build like a Michelangelo a female figure, and she stands there proudly with her sandwich and her riveter as she goes back to work. So it's interesting, these Michelangelo things become so much part of our visual dialogue that it kind of, and he does also these Sibyls, these prophetesses. And here is the Libyan Sybil, which is my favorite of them. And look again at the color, that golden glow. And she takes this huge book off the shelf that I guess contains her prophecies. As again, that kind of serpentine kind of twist of her figure as she reaches up. And again, a very masculine figure. If we look at the red chalk drawing that he did of it from a male model, we can see how directly, and then here he's trying to feminize the features of the face, from this, which is more, the male model. And then here he tries to soften it. He works on that foot and that hand that are in such interesting, foreshortening. Very difficult to draw, beautiful drawing. But you can see how, once again, the use, of male models in the female figures gives them this heroicism, a Herculean kind of a feeling, this monumental, high Renaissance, very authoritative language of form. He does it, in the order that I was telling you. That is, it goes, I wanted to show something else. He took all of the scaffolding down at one point to look at it, because he had never looked at it except this close, right? So at one point they took it all down and he changed it. I mean, he didn't change what he had done, but these Sibyls and prophets at this later end of the painting are much larger than the ones here, are smaller. They kind of take over their space and become larger. So Michelangelo, who really hadn't painted all that much before, is actually, we get to see the development of his style. We get to see the development of his mastery of form. Nowhere is this easier seen, I think, than David and Goliath. And over here, this strange scene of the brazen serpent. First of all, David and Goliath. David hovers over the huge giant about to behead him. Very straightforward, and you can see this kind of triangular space. Can you see the windows here and so forth? It's a little hard to read the photograph, but it's right in that kind of triangle there in the corner. If you go to the opposite end, we have a very strange scene. And this one is the adoration, I guess, of the brazen serpent. And Christians have picked out this very obscure story from the book of Exodus, where God is angry at the Hebrews for some reason, and he sends snakes and they bite people and people get sick and they die. And then Moses asks him to provide some relief. They've learned their lesson. And he says a strange thing, make a brass serpent and hang it on a tree, and all who have been bitten and look at that serpent will be cured. So here he shows, and look at how strangely these contorted figures fit into that triangular space. It's really weird with the foot here. They're gnashing their teeth, back in there, surrounded by serpents. We're reminded of that Leia Quan sculpture, right? With the serpents devouring the sons of Leia Quan. Here they wrap around people's thing. But here is Moses, and he lifts up a woman who gestures toward the brass serpent and therefore is healed. It's a strange story, and most Jewish people aren't even familiar with it. The Christians have picked it out because in it they see a prefiguration of Jesus on the cross. And just as the first serpent led people the wrong direction morally, now the kind of new serpent, so to speak, will lead them in the right direction. It's an obscure and kind of strange story, and he tells it strangely. And again, the weird way that people are, the weird composition, partly to do with the triangular shape, which is hard to compose within, but he's really cramming them in a really kind of strange and interesting way. Also, there are these inuti, I think 22 of them. They sort of are all over the place, peppered around in between the various scenes. And they often look like they've been doing something naughty that they were caught at, like this one. And, I guess angels or athletes, we're not sure. Now that we know that Michelangelo, wrote love sonnets to a man, the homoerotic aspect of these nudes, the very playful nudes, is now obvious to us, but it was probably lost on audiences then. Well, Pope Julius dies, and they say, let's finish up this endless commission once and for all. And his family commissions, Michelangelo kind of puts together what's left. And this is what the tomb ends up being, as it is now in the Church of St. Peter in Chains. And Moses is a fantastic figure and probably represented the Pope himself, a very idealized version of the Pope. Moses has come down from the mountaintop after getting the 10 Commandments, the stone commandments, which you see under his arm. And he sees that the Hebrews have started worshiping the golden calf, and he's angry. And in a moment, he's going to rise up and break the tablet, saying that you're not worthy of this law. So again, like in his David, it's the moment before the action that gives it this terribila, right? This before, that moment before. Well, the next pope is a Medici Pope who Michelangelo knows very well. Pope Leo X, who had been the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And he's the same age as Michelangelo, a couple months younger. And Leo respected Michelangelo, but he didn't like to work with Michelangelo very much because he felt he was very difficult to work with. And I think there's some history there too, because, if you're a 15-year-old boy and your father, Lorenzo the Magnificent, brings home another 15-year-old boy and said, this is the divine Michelangelo. I want you all to meet him. He enters discourse with the father's friends and everything. I can imagine that this would be very hurtful. I'm glad my father did not bring in, a 15-year-old rival. So I think maybe Leo, so what he did is he said, I'm going to give you let's go back to Florence and we'll give you more tasks in Florence, because he liked working with Raphael and Bramante, but he didn't like working with Michelangelo. Okay, so he said, let's design a facade for a San Lorenzo church in Florence, right? I know we're getting to the end of the hour, but I'm almost finished. Although, you could go on and on. You could do a whole semester, on Michelangelo. So this is the unfinished facade of San Lorenzo by Brunelleschi, by the very first, the guy who made the dome of the Florence Cathedral a century before, and they still haven't designed a facade. So Leo says, go design this facade. And Michelangelo works on it, and he comes up with this beautiful model of a facade that really is one of his first architectural projects. But the Florentines decide not to use it. And the patron, who was Lorenzo's grandson, Lorenzo II, died. And so they never completed it. But through the miracle of Photoshop, we've been able to take a model of Michelangelo's facade and to put it on the San Lorenzo. And this is what it would look like. There were going to be statues in the niches. We can't do those. We can't do that. But we could put some sort of facade, because I think anything is better than this, almost, But the Florentines still haven't done it, and still in the works. They're still advocates for finishing it according to Michelangelo. It's kind of an odd looking thing. Well, when Lorenzo II died, he was the Duke of Urbino, and the Pope made him the Duke of Urbino, much to the dismay of the people from Urbino. So he died, and he was the one who was actually commissioning this facade. So this was put on hold, it was never finished. And instead he said, let's design this sacristy back here as a burial place for Lorenzo's grandson, Lorenzo II, he's called. And already in that sacristy are buried Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother Giuliano de' Medici. We're just like in the floor. And then they commissioned Michelangelo to do Lorenzo II and Giulio, another Medici. And here's the thing. Now, he also did the architectural setting. So you can see in the new sacristy at San Lorenzo, where he did these tombs, it's not just the sculpture, it's the whole ensemble, the beautiful Pietra Serena, the way he takes two stories and links them by one kind of colossal pilaster. And we'll be looking at this more next week. And it kind of brings us to the end of the hour. So I thought this would probably be a good place to stop. Now, I, in an earlier lecture on Leonardo, mistakenly said that it was Lorenzo the Magnificent that was buried in this, and that's wrong. It was Lorenzo II. Lorenzo was in the sacristy, buried under the floor. But what he did is he used the new Lorenzo to be a type of the contemplative type and the active type, so that these two sculptures that he had in his mind for the tomb of Julius that were never realized, now he gets a chance to kind of realize them and also do a beautiful interior architectural setting. Then next week, as we look at the artist as he matures into his 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, how he continues to pursue his vision and to pursue particularly architecture. We're going to be looking at a lot of architecture next time. Okay, so thank you for having me, and we'll finish up Michelangelo in about a month from